welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I am the host of this series. So first things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Right off the bat, I do want to encourage you to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is at NotSpicedRum, and my Instagram handle is at SomeGuyNamedMorgan. So please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page, and certainly keep up with this show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms it is available. So, as you've probably heard, Joe Biden, or at least his handlers, announced on August 24th of 2022 that the government would be stepping in to aid Americans who have college tuition debt. Specifically, this policy would purportedly cancel $10,000 of student debt for low and middle income borrowers. Now, this plan has drawn a very deeply polarized reaction throughout the United States. There are some, certainly too many, who are praising Biden for this policy. As far as they're concerned, the debt cancellation policy is similar to an elephant being taken off of many of these college graduates' debt-ridden backs. That's really how they see it. They see this debt transfer, because that's what it is in reality, as some much-needed help for those who are struggling in debt. The people who support Biden's policy, who are very much on the left, are celebrating this as a victory for the underdog. To them, the little guy is finally catching a break, or so it would seem, and the government, as a result, is so great and noble and benevolent to put their interests before those of big business. Now, before I go any further, I do want to emphasize here that I'm simply stating their perspective on the matter, not my own. So, in this case, what's the other perspective on this matter? I mean, for as many as there are out there who are pleased about this, there are certainly just as many, probably many more, who are unhappy, even furious about this. Their mentality is that, sure, it's economically idiotic, and of course, it's only going to worsen the very things in society that these same people who support it have been complaining about. But beyond that, on a deeper level, it's fundamentally unjust. They find something infuriating just on a primal level about this. To them, they shouldn't be punished or made to pay for someone else's debt after years of, investing responsibly with their funds, of planning out their budgets carefully, and making these financial sacrifices to pay off their own debts. As far as they're concerned, this isn't a matter of compassion or having a lack of empathy, since compassion and empathy are completely meaningless when they're forced through government coercion. They're also convinced that Biden's plan won't really put an end to the problem. They see it as ineffective against the greater problem of sky-high tuition and the future loans that are going to be taken out down the line to cover that tuition. Now, for the past few minutes, I've really been trying to sound objective and neutral on this issue, at least as much as I can. But at this point, I've really been neutral long enough. I'm just going to lay my cards on the table here and say that I agree with the latter group. This policy is horrendous. I mean, I'm very deeply opposed to this plan. I'm a libertarian to the core, so naturally, if the government tells me that now I have to make financial sacrifices, having done nothing wrong, to support these people who made poor decisions and can't be bothered to deal with it themselves, I mean, that goes very much against my personal anti-state principles. I mean, let's be real now. We all personally know or have known someone we can't stand, perhaps back in high school or something like that, who's now getting their loans forgiven on our dime. I mean, why should that entitled jerk get off scot-free? That's not just. I mean, this is so brazenly tyrannical and coercive that, I mean, I genuinely don't know how Biden's administration found the courage to come out with this policy. Anyway, though, as I was saying, I'm opposed to Biden's plan because it conflicts with my own libertarian ideals. I consider myself to be very much an individualist at the end of the day. And when we follow the philosophy of individualism through to its natural end, I mean, if we're going to truly fight for individual rights in any consistent or meaningful sense, then we obviously can't punish an individual for the mistakes made by a second individual simply because a third individual said they had to on some random, arbitrary whim. And furthermore, this third individual, the one who makes this decree regarding the payment between these other two individuals, they can't have the power to make this order in the first place. If someone does, not only is this not libertarian, this is not an individual society at all. This is a collectivist society. Period. End of story here. Now, to understand where exactly this policy goes wrong as a so-called solution, we need to look at the problem of college tuition and debt itself. Now, I completely agree that college is completely, unjustifiably, unacceptably, outrageously, infuriatingly, horrifyingly high. Okay? I get that. But the question we really need to ask here is why? Is it because these universities are just providing that precious of a service? I mean, come on, the very idea of that is just laughable. So in that case, what does cause college tuition to be as high as it is? And not only that, but why have these college prices skyrocketed so much over the past several decades? I mean, is it just to punish those of us for being born in this generation? I mean, I'm joking here, but from a distance, it can really feel that way in a sense, So, in short, yes, it does come down to there being greater demand for college now. Yes, this demand does come down to the hope of having better job prospects after you graduate, but more so, and more importantly, I would say, it's because of government subsidies. And this is really the root of the problem. That is, other than the fact that we have a federal government in the first place. But in any case, these massive subsidies are granted by the government to support this system of universities. They might go towards different departments, towards salaries for teachers, for staff, for federal loans, Pell Grants for students, you name it. Now, where is it that the government gets the money for these subsidies? Exactly where you would suspect. I mean, where else are they going to get it? These subsidies are just another tax burden. Now, I know some people out there are going to defend the subsidization because it's for a good cause, but the problem here is that sometimes good causes can result in bad effects. And this is especially true when the government gets involved. So this really leads me into my next point. These government subsidies are intended by short-sighted people to make college more affordable. But they forget that when you subsidize something, you make it both cheaper to consume and easier to obtain. Now, this actually creates an artificial demand. And what I mean by this exactly is that when the government makes it easier to afford and access something than it would have been otherwise, naturally more people are going to try to consume that good or service because it comes to them at less of a cost personally. That is, at least in the immediate short term. When the government does this for something such as higher education, where you already have so many people just clamoring to get in to begin with, demand becomes absurdly high, and there are only so many people who can get in the first place. So naturally, prices are going to rise, and they're going to rise quite a bit. On another note, though, tuition has increased by quite a lot over the past generation. I was actually reading a Forbes article recently by Preston Cooper, great writer, by the way. He does give a very no-nonsense, objective assessment of the economics behind higher education. He was saying that the net price of public four-year colleges has still more than doubled since the turn of the century, and that's despite financial aid. I mean, at this point, such a level of blatant, arrogant greed can really be frustrating. I mean, it's beyond frustrating. It's infuriating for any young person who's trying to get through college, or for that matter, for any taxpayer who's being forced to pay for these institutions. And moreover, underlying costs at American colleges are actually the highest of any large country in the developed world. Now, people, might look at the situation and consider this broken, completely dysfunctional system to be capitalism. They see these outrageously, cripplingly overpriced universities, and they just come away with, well, that's capitalist greed for you. This has nothing to do with capitalism. And this misdiagnosis has been the cause of a lot of problems throughout the years. Such a broken, overpriced system could not function in a free market because, well, that's really something I have to break down here. Without government interference, you would have a series of competing, completely privatized universities, and the only means they would have of actually surviving and staying afloat in the market would be to compete with these other universities. Now, this comes down to profit, and in a free market, profit would be exchanged exclusively between the buyer and the seller. Nobody else. There would be no third party, such as the government. The university would have a budget, and along with that, they would also have a quota that they would have to meet. In turn, they would calculate how many students would actually need to enroll. They'd have to gauge what programs they're drawn to, what majors have the highest demand, etc., etc. And they would have to establish a tuition and an education that could actually compete with the other universities out there. But when the government steps in, this all goes out the window. The government basically incentivizes bureaucracy and inefficiency through these regulations that also serve to stifle competition in the marketplace. So that's really the system we have right now, and you don't have to look very hard to see the negative effects it has on students, as well as for all of society. We all personally know college graduates who have been up to their eyeballs in debt for their entire adult life, and this debt just follows them around like a rain cloud, like their shadow, basically. And this is to say nothing of how badly it hurts their credit as well. I mean, good luck getting a mortgage in this market when you're hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt already. Also, I find it very telling that there's something about these particular loans, that is college loans, that sets them apart from other forms of debt, in that even if you file bankruptcy, that still won't make the loans go away. They'll still be there weighing you down. And at that point, I mean, that just really seems like you're kicking someone while they're down. But as a side note, by the way, I do want to mention that the reason these loans are so hard to discharge in the first place is because of governmental rulings. But anyway, due to this broken system, the debt that these students take on will end up being too much for their wages to cover in some cases. And that's especially true if you majored in some stupid, lousy degree like gender studies. I mean, this debt can be a very large burden, even for the students who made all the correct, responsible choices during their college years. And that in itself should be a dead giveaway that something is wrong with the market here. And that's not to mention a virtually insurmountable burden for people who wasted their time in some useless degree ending in studies. So, as time goes by, and the college tuition increases further and further, and this massive debt becomes more widespread throughout our society, it really starts to impact the overall standard of living. So, despite being against government intervention in this matter, there's a part of me that really does pity a lot of these people who are struggling with their student loans. I mean, really now, if you're shackled to such an enormous amount of debt so early in life when you're still really young, I mean, that's naturally going to leave you feeling like you've lost in the game of life before it even started. You end up growing older feeling as though you've just been cheated out of a fair chance at being successful in life. And from there, people start thinking that the game is rigged against them. People will start thinking that if this game right here, if this is what we call capitalism, which in reality it isn't at all, is unfair, then we need to take action to make it fair. And if we need to, we've got to use government force. So this ends up creating a demand for socialism from people who are ignorant of how economics works. And this also neatly explains the Bernie Sanders movement, by the way. But anyway, in response to this government-made crisis, they end up looking, ironically, to the government as their savior. So in a roundabout sort of way, the government's own corrupt, inefficient practices work in their own favor. The government creates a problem, scapegoats private industry, and then it goes ahead and is able to increase its own power and worsen this original problem, all at the expense of private industry. So as a quick side note, I am seeing a lot of parallels between the housing bubble that we had, several years ago and what we can call the college bubble. To drive this home, college debt has grown at a rate similar to mortgage debt prior to that infamous housing bubble. And in addition to this, the cost of college has risen much, much faster than inflation. So to put this into perspective for you exactly, the cost of college tuition actually increased 945% from 1980 to 2012. And the overall rate of inflation itself was approximately 180% between those same years. So as you can see, that's over 5 times as much of a rate increase. But the obvious question here is why? And unfortunately, this is the question that not many people are actually asking. This really comes down to a much greater demand. But like I was saying earlier, this demand itself originates from subsidies. Now, I'm a die-hard follower of the Austrian School of Economics, and I've noticed a lot of parallels between this college bubble and a concept that exists within the Austrian school, known as the Austrian business cycle theory. So basically how it works is that the central banks print too much money, and they end up lowering interest rates artificially below the point of equilibrium, which is to say the optimal point where supply and demand meet. This is exactly what government's doing with higher education subsidies. Next, this easier access to credit encourages more people to invest. In this particular case, banks are more likely to give out student loans if they're backed up by the government, because that eliminates any risk on their end. And this obviously means that there will be a great deal of malinvestment. So we can obviously see from this, how these students are unable to pay off these loans in the first place. I mean, if it was a good investment, it wouldn't be such an overwhelming, unconquerable, unstoppable burden to these people who simply can't find gainful enough employment with their degree. Anyway, from there, the boom turns into a bust once reality strikes and the investors are faced with the realization that there's no longer enough savings to actually support these investments. Now, once again, in the particular case we're talking about right now, they invested money into college because the government distorted the price signals that banks would have received in a free market. So from there, at this point, these bad investments must be liquidated. And that is to say, closed down, terminated, dissolved, which is precisely what happened in the housing bubble as well. And Biden's college tuition forgiveness plan is only accelerating this process and will only bring us there faster in the long run. Now, at this point of the cycle, as the entrepreneurs and the investors try to repair and readjust from here, this would be the recession period. But when the government keeps intervening, they're really just prolonging this period because they're preventing the private sector from assessing the accurate price signals of the marketplace. For example, thanks to the efforts of people like Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this is exactly why the Great Depression lasted as long as it did, because the government kept interfering with the realignment process. So I really can't emphasize enough how absolutely broken the college system is at the moment. Students spend 4 years of their life, or even more once you consider medical school, law school, business, whatever, giving up money that they haven't even earned yet in the first place to get a piece of paper that just turns out to be useless in many cases. And why did they do it? They did it because from pre-K through high school, it's been drilled into their heads that a college degree is absolutely essential to be successful. That if you don't have a college degree, your entire career is going to be one massive burden. And as a result of this social conditioning, a lot of people have been swindled by this college scam. And that's exactly what it is. It's a scam at this point. There's really nothing else to say. So with tuition as high as it is, with all of these useless majors and all of these unnecessary departments, with the administrations at these schools that are just so bloated and bureaucratic, there's really no other way to describe this. However, with this said, I personally oppose the government just stepping in and transferring this debt elsewhere, because this is a terrible way of actually addressing the real problem. It makes zero effort, no effort at all to get to the actual root of this problem, because the state, the very state that is addressing this problem, is the problem. So, in that case, with this in mind, why is it that some other people want to cancel student debt? What actually causes people to advocate this and say that this is what needs to happen? What makes them think that this issue warrants the government stepping in and just coercing individuals who have absolutely nothing to do with this problem? To put this in probably the most simple terms I can, it really comes down to people who are thinking with their hearts rather than their brains. Or perhaps more precisely, they're thinking emotionally rather than logically. They're not thinking with reason. So yes, I'm opposed to this particular plan, but I simultaneously can't help but sympathize with a lot of these people who are, quite frankly, being railroaded by this plan. This is really where the pro-cancellation mindset begins in many cases. Now, whereas I'm able to understand that this policy is not going to bring about good effects, there are a lot of people out there who do feel sympathetic towards these people. They see them struggling to make it in the marketplace despite this overwhelming debt on their back, which is understandable. And I would even say it's admirable if you do understand how this problem works and they're able to think of, a more appropriate solution, which these leftists don't. Let's be honest here. Let's face it. The left, who has been advocating socialism and government intervention, just does not have a good track record up until this point anyway. And what about the actual students who have this debt? Yes, obviously they're going to be more supportive of the government canceling their debt, but this is clearly because somebody in their position is going to be extremely biased on the subject. To people who are absolutely cornered, absolutely doomed by this debt, the rationale is very simplistic and superficial. They think debt is my problem. If I have no debt officially to my name, I have no problem. I'm, for all intents and purposes, free. And the problem is that this is unfortunately born out of an animalistic, desperate urge rather than anything that's actually rational. They're not doing it because this policy actually has merit. It's because a person who's looking to get their debt removed their entire rationale is going to be, oh, well, better someone else's problem than mine. However, people who support the government transferring this debt still attempt to make some pretty flimsy justifications about this morally. The people who are pro-cancellation, they try to paint themselves as standing up for the little guy, whereas the giant lenders are these greedy people who can afford the hit, and they can still carry on with their lives despite that. But in reality, though, through more of an economics lens, it's not that simple. The pro-cancellation mindset itself really does stem from this deep economic ignorance. It's not like you're going to just transfer all of this debt to the taxpayers, and then everything in the economy is just going to continue as though nothing happened the next day. There's going to be peripheral, some deeply negative changes in response to this. Because after all, I mean, who is it that really pays for this cancellation? The universities who are charging this horrible tuition aren't taking the hit, and neither are the banks who have been incentivized by the government to give out these outrageously burdensome loans through federal backing. No, let's be honest here. We know that it comes down to the American taxpayer to cover this, as it always has whenever the government tries to take credit for handling a crisis. And to make matters worse, if we look at this pro-cancellation mentality, people who oppose cancellation are to these people, somehow they're advocates of the existing system. People who oppose cancellation are, in effect, portrayed as defenders of the status quo. People who want student debt canceled see themselves as the one who are trying to make a change, and to their credit, they are making a change. It just happens to be one that's certainly for the worse. But in addition to this, I do think it's pretty interesting how they portray their opponents. For example, I believe that student debt being canceled, transferred more accurately, via government intervention by its very nature is going to cause a lot more problems than it ends up solving. But people who push for economic interventionism dismiss this all the same, and they'll inevitably strawman me as hating the poor, as having no sympathy for these poor graduates. And worst of all, and most blatantly false, mind you, they hypocritically act as though my fellow libertarians and myself support this existing system that put these people into this debt in the first place, when in reality, the opposite is true. I mean, how do you think this college system became this bad in the first place? Do you think private enterprise, that is, the private lenders and the private universities, all just unanimously decided to massively raise their prices? Because after all, it's not like competitive prices matter in a free marketplace or anything. Do you think that universities just decided that, having made all of this profit on their own steam, that they just decided from there to pour it all into these gender studies departments, or that the best move from a business standpoint was to waste money and capital on bureaucratic departments and administrations that by their very nature could never justify the return of investment? I mean, really, do you think that they could afford to make these risky business moves without government assistance safeguarding or cushioning any losses that they might incur, or requiring this type of system through their regulations? Or do you think that, realistically, the government stepped in to subsidize these banks, to fund these universities, and to offer its own loans and grants directly, bypassing the banks altogether in a sense? So, yes, I see this system, and I think it's horrible, and I do think it needs to change, and I would say probably more so than the pro-cancellation crowd. But it's just obvious to me that these people don't have a functional plan here. Now, to be fair, in all fairness, the student debt burden that the pro-cancellation crowd condemns so intensely would be removed from these particular individuals. I mean, if you owe $10,000 in debt to an organization, and then the government steps in and forcibly takes that debt away from the organization, then yes, you would formally, and I really want to put emphasis on the word formally here, in that case, you would not have that debt. If a bank is hounding you about those $10,000 you owe them, and the government steps in and forces them to stop, then yes, that particular individual would no longer owe that particular sum of money to that particular lender. But what these people neglect to think about is that that debt would still exist and it would still have an impact on society. It just simply wouldn't be attached to that person's personal record. Now, this is precisely the point where these people who advocate the government canceling student debt completely tune out and stop paying attention to the problem altogether. So people who support debt cancellation would consider this a victory, but the truth is that it's only a victory in the most short-sighted, superficial way possible. I mean, this is really a textbook classic example of a Pyrrhic victory, if you will. They end up overlooking the many other problems that are going to arise from this, and ironically, it will actually undo the help that they think this policy will do. For example, if somebody has $10,000 less of debt, that really doesn't mean much as the taxes and prices increase to the point where they are able to replace that burden. And the real injustice here is that now this doesn't apply only to people who stupidly took out loans that they couldn't cover, but also for the people who made the wiser investments, who worked hard to pay off these loans. And that's not to mention for the people who didn't take out any loans at all. So the reality is that transferring debt simply makes the debt a problem for everybody in the end. Naturally, though, people don't take this into consideration. They want this burden of debt to be removed, and for a reason that I will never understand, they blame the private sector for this. From there, they conclude that if private industry is the problem, then government must be the solution. So from here, they turn to the government to step in and do something. And, some people out there might see the government as more noble than the private sector because it's more willing to forgive debts. But keep in mind, they're forgetting that profit and loss mean very little to the actual state. If the government's out money, they can just inflate the monetary supply, they can increase taxes, they can place tariffs, and so on and so forth, without any real consequence for them personally, and they can simply blame it on the private sector from there. So, anyway, on a deeper level, what does this pro-cancellation mindset lead its advocates to actually propose? Well, it leads them to propose exactly what's being implemented now, and that is to say Joe Biden's debt transfer plan. At its core, this plan to take $10,000 of college debt away is really no more than, to put it in the most intellectual phrasing I possibly can, it's the material manifestation of economic ignorance. And look, this isn't the first time that the government has made efforts to deal with the finances involving higher education. For example, just to spell this out for you, we had the Higher Education Amendments back in 1992. We had the Higher Education Reconciliation Act in 2005, the College Cost Reduction and Access Act in 2007, along with many others. So, with these policies passed, we've got to ask, did any of these examples improve the situation? I mean, look at the situation we have today. If it did, if it truly improved the situation, why are things the way they are now? There's really no excuse for this horrible situation. I mean, if the government's intervention is just so crucial and necessary, and the government has been intervening for such a long time now, then why are people complaining now that debt is worse than ever? Why are they asking the government to step in now? Why hasn't the government been able to prevent the system from getting out of control? And the answer is because it simply can't, by its very own nature. So, anyway, at this point, I really do want to delve into the specifics of this actual loan forgiveness plan. So I already took the liberty of pulling up the official policy announcement straight from the horse's mouth, and that is to say whitehouse.gov, the actual announcement of this policy. So with this here, I can actually examine the exact document, and I can go through, point by point and offer up my thoughts and rebuttals to it. So in order for us to find out what this pro-cancellation mindset causes people to call for, I figured this would be the perfect place to look. Okay, so I'm just going to be reading from the beginning. It describes this policy as, and I quote, a three-part plan to cancel $10,000 of debt for low to middle income borrowers. This applies to federal loans, such as Pell Grants, which are a grant and not a loan, which are not private ones. The total cost of both public and private universities has more than tripled since 1980, even accounting for inflation. All right, so I have to step in here. My thoughts are that I find it very telling that the White House doesn't actually explain why this actually is. They neglect to mention that, the emergence of federally backed student loans. They also don't mention, public universities versus private universities. So if lenders are assured that they're going to be paid back no matter what happens, then naturally they're going to lend more money because they don't have any skin in the game anymore, so to speak. This is going to create an influx of people who are just rushing to take on these loans. And because of this influx, these prices are going to rise. But of course, the government leaves this part out. Anyway, continuing from there, nearly 1/3 of borrowers have debt, but no degree, according to an analysis by the Department of Education of a recent cohort of undergraduates. My point exactly. This is practically the definition of malinvestment. If a full third of these students aren't even getting a degree in the first place, then that's proof positive that these funds are being distributed irresponsibly. I mean, it really doesn't take a genius here to see that if malinvestment is so widespread in a particular industry like this, then something has to be preventing these investors from making wise investments in the first place. In a free market where losses are incurred, privately, where people take on the losses and it's their own problem, essentially, lenders would be much more cautious and hesitant about their investments, or else they would be taking a tremendous loss. But the government has subsidized these losses, in a sense, socializing these losses. And the reality now is that the taxpayer ends up covering the losses. The third part, listed as Biden's three-part plan that I see here, is to reduce the cost of college by giving out more Pell Grants. Now, the justification behind this, according to the site, is that federal support has not kept up. Pell Grants once covered nearly 80% of the cost of a 4-year public college degree for students from working families, but now only cover a third. All right, so I want to let you know that this is not the full story. This focuses on Pell Grants being given out on the individual level, but it leaves out the fact that much more money is being put towards Pell Grants than ever before. For example, between 2009 and 2013, the government went from a $15 billion budget for Pell Grants to $35 billion. Yet Biden is promising to issue out even more as part of his plan. The White House is just neglecting to mention this increase to make it sound as though the problem arose because America is putting less money into Pell Grants, when in reality it's exactly the opposite. They're putting, more money than ever. It's just that these particular individuals have a smaller portion of their tuition, on the individual level going towards the college tuition. In reality, the last thing that the situation actually requires is even more taxpayer-funded Pell Grants. And also, I was reading from a Pew study recently that found that federal loans actually increased 376% between 1990 and 2013, and that's after accounting for inflation. So I don't know how you can hear that, then look at the current state of higher education, and then conclude that we need more government funding for it. And, of course, Biden plans to make community college free. I mean, we've all heard this line before. We all know how that goes. I don't think that much needs to be said about it. What all of this really means is more taxation and inflation. As for taking steps to lower the costs that the colleges themselves charge, it reads, and I quote, "Meanwhile, colleges have an obligation to keep prices reasonable and ensure borrowers get value for their investments, not debt they cannot afford. This administration has already taken key steps to strengthen accountability, including in areas where the previous administration weakened rules." So the first sentence is certainly correct, but overall this is pretty vague when you compare it to the rest of the document. So what are they going to do exactly? Are they going to cease all government funding and leave colleges and lenders to their own devices? I wish, I really do. But the rest of this document confirms that they're going to be moving in the exact opposite direction. And on a side note, I know they were very eager to throw in that criticism towards Trump so they can frame themselves as the good guys. And I just think that the fact that this type of partisanship runs so deeply through our society that they'll blame Donald Trump, who is completely unrelated to this train wreck of a proposal, it really speaks to how polarized our country is right now. And what I also find amusing in a strange sort of way is that as of the time I'm recording this podcast episode, if you actually go to apply for these loans, there's a message that reads, and I'll quote from that as well, "Application is open, but debt discharge is paused. As a result of a court order, we are temporarily blocked from processing debt discharges. We encourage you to apply if you are eligible. We will continue to review applications, and we will quickly process discharges when we are able to do so, and you will not need to reapply." So, in other words, we can't legally get our stuff together right now, and we're trying to push this through anyway. This policy is so hated that people within our own ranks are trying to stop us from doing this, but we don't care. Just apply anyway, and we'll work on that as soon as we get this thing passed. It reeks of unprofessional behavior. And on another note, what I find to be pound for pound even more morally repugnant than the government forgiving $10,000 of student loans is public service loan forgiveness. Ironically, people seem to overlook this, and they kind of devote all of their criticism toward the $10,000 forgiveness plan. So, in that case, why is it exactly that I'm so opposed to the public service forgiveness? So I want to make clear that this is not merely $10,000 that would be forgiven. This is the entirety of the debt, regardless of the amount. Now, when I first heard about this, I immediately noticed how this policy benefits people who work for the government even more than those who are already getting the $10,000 forgiven. And don't even get me started on the people who have no college debt at all. But, the hidden message here is subtle, but it's unmistakable. The government takes care of its own people. It's going to blatantly prioritize the public sphere over the private one, and then it has the audacity to turn around and act as though private enterprise is corrupt or greedy or morally bankrupt. Now, the application deadline at the time I'm recording this was set to October 31st of 2022, which is approximately a week before the midterm elections, and I certainly don't think that this was any coincidence. The way I see it, if the Democrats were truly confident in their performance prior to the midterm elections, why would this last-ditch attempt to buy votes even be necessary in the first place? This is obviously polarizing. It's inevitably going to turn away a significant portion of this country at the expense of a different portion. And even these government officials can't be out of tune enough, they can't be stupid enough to actually believe that this is not the case. They can't be so out of tune with our country's political climate that they're going to overlook this. So, with this in mind, the only conclusion we can really draw from here is that this policy is being pushed out of desperation. On the surface, it's supposed to be this noble act, we Democrats and our divine benevolence, which is not from us, but actually from completely different people, are going to lighten your burden because we're just that empathetic. No. In reality, it's gas prices soared, inflation soared, we're rapidly approaching the world war that we thought Trump would cause, and we had an obscene amount of our own workers, both in the public and private sector, lose their jobs simply because they didn't consent to this new vaccine that was forced onto the market. Things aren't looking good for us, and since we are the state, our true measure of success is power. We're going to lose our political power if we don't do something, so let's just bribe them with tuition forgiveness. Maybe that can give us the boost we need. Joe Biden, or more accurately, the people who actually speak through him, did make a really empty attempt to justify this policy. Joe Biden said that dedicated public servants are the lifeblood of democracy. They do the hard work that is essential to our country's success, protecting us, teaching our children, keeping our streets clean and our lights on, and so much more. Okay, so look, I'm sure that there is hard, valuable work out there that is performed by people who just so happen to be public servants. But this rationale that Biden gives really does beg a lot of questions. First of all, democracy is horrible. I mean, if you don't believe me, read Democracy, The God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe and tell me that I'm wrong. If public service is its lifeblood, I say let it bleed out. In any case, though, the examples that he listed are also provided privately. I know some people are going to argue that since the majority of our protection, our education, and our groundskeeping, comes from public servants, they should be given a higher priority, and due to the importance of these tasks, it's only fair that they're eligible for loan forgiveness, for total loan forgiveness. Now, putting aside the absurdity of using the concept of fairness in relation to this tuition forgiveness plan, these particular industries have a government-induced monopoly, so that doesn't really mean much. For example, you might cite the postal workers as valuable public servants, but in reality, that's only because the private industry was barred from setting up its own mail delivery system. And just to give you a quick background on this story, Lysander Spooner, he was a great anarchist thinker. He noticed that the post office had very high rates, and in response to that, he started his company, which was the American Letter Mail Company. So the full story here is best saved for another episode down the line, but long story short, the government was hopelessly unable to compete with Spooner, and it went so far that they actually had to pass a law back in 1851 explicitly giving the federal government a legal monopoly over delivering mail. The government had to use force to prohibit private mails because their greater efficiency posed a threat to the state's power. I mean, I've heard, if you can't beat them, join them, but I mean, in this case, it's more like if you can't beat them, phase them out entirely with force. Anyway, it is subtle, but it's really telling that the government is just leaving total loan forgiveness exclusively for people who work for the government. They've left the broken university system completely intact and poised to grow worse than ever before. They've punished the vast majority of innocent taxpayers to subsidize and incentivize people who've made bad investments. And now this on top of it. I mean, that's at least 3 levels of dysfunction, and that's just going off of the most superficial, surface-level analysis. So what really happens when this debt is canceled? What's going to happen if this policy does go through unimpeded? Yes, some students will have less that they have to pay, but then what happens? How do banks respond? How do the lenders respond? Some people might point out that this loan forgiveness only actually applies to federal loans, but realistically, there's obviously going to be an indirect yet enormous effect on private loans in response to this policy, because you're essentially completely altering the market by implementing this tuition forgiveness plan. What about universities? Aren't they just going to up their prices even higher in response to this? And what about the government? I mean, they're obviously going to turn to higher taxation, higher inflation to fund this plan, from here and from here going forward. And that's going to make life harder in all areas, not just the realm of affording college. It's obviously not safe to give this much power to the state, yet for some reason a disturbingly high portion of our society doesn't seem to care, and even welcomes it as long as it placates them in the most extremely short-term way possible, just so long as they get their instant gratification. And what really disturbs me, and what is just very sad to me, is that we're really sacrificing our most basic freedoms and our ability just to navigate our own lives on a daily basis simply because an obscenely high number of people in this country have a very, very high time preference. Now, why is it that this results, rather than something positive, as the government would want us to believe? So what is the fatal flaw here exactly? So what it comes down to is that the people who support economic intervention really tend to only follow this intervention up to a certain point, and then they ignore it past that. They only look at the government's effect on some groups of people in the short term, rather than looking at all groups of people in the long term, which they completely dismiss. In this particular case, they see people who have debt. Then the government comes in and they take their debt away. And then these people no longer have debt. It's apparently just that simple. Everybody just happily dances off into the sunset. But obviously, there's more going on here than just that. I mean, if we continue with that metaphor, what happens after the sunset? What happens when the sun rises the next morning? And this is really the problem here. Colleges raise their prices, tax burdens become heavier, loans get even more predatory than they were before, and the demand for the government to spend more taxpayer money, quote-unquote, canceling these future loans, will only get increasingly worse over time. It's like a cycle. We know this is going to result, so why do we do it? People still push for student debt to get transferred, probably very much aware that it's going to cause issues in the long term. They're probably very well aware that it's going to cause further problems in a peripheral sort of way, but they push the policy through anyway, because to them, the present problem of these people shackled to the debt is more immediately perceptible than the problems that are down the line, because those actually require imagination and foresight to recognize in the moment. I mentioned a little bit earlier that most people in our society have a very high time preference. Now, in economics, the concept of time preference refers to the actual amount of time that somebody's willing to delay their gratification in order to meet a particular goal. Now, ideally, somebody would want to have a low time preference because achieving more substantial goals down the line is going to naturally require more personal sacrifice in the here and now in order to make that happen. Since personal sacrifice is hard, a lot of people are naturally going to look to minimize it as much as they can, even to the point where it distorts our own judgments about the effects of these economic policies, even if it causes more problems than we would have had otherwise. To put it as simply as I can, people are really looking at this issue in terms of what's easy rather than what's right. And if your main priority is simply getting short-term comfort, then you're not going to understand the difference between these two questions. I know full well that countless people are going to rush to file their applications for forgiveness. I mean, let's face it, let's be real now. People will do anything to get something for free or to get out of their own responsibilities. That's exactly what the government is counting on. I mean, just going off of my current day job in banking, I've been accosted by enough aggressive customers just insisting that I rebate their overdraft fees, just to cement this for me personally. Now, many people are going to hear this, and they'll see this, and they'll turn around and say that this is exactly why we need centralized government. They'll argue that because humans are greedy and act in their own self-interest at the expense of others, that's why the government needs to keep them in check. I would say exactly the opposite. I've never claimed that human nature is so noble, or humanitarian, or benevolent, but rather it's because people are inherently selfish and corrupt that we can't afford to have a central state, because, first of all, The government is run by humans who are bound by this human nature just like the rest of us, so I don't know why you would give such extreme coercive power to an institution like this. I mean, it's really silly to think that these government mediators are going to be different from others, and, I mean, let's be real here. People, they don't get jobs in government, they don't get jobs in politics just because they happen to be such moral, decent people who want to make a great difference. I mean, it's a bid for power. Second, when you establish a state, becoming successful in a particular industry no longer revolves around providing the best product or service, but rather just appeasing that state. This is exactly why we have so many lobbyists, a significant amount representing higher education, mind you, who turn to the government to hinder and distort the marketplace in their favor. Private entities, just by their very own nature, have certain boundaries that they cannot cross. I mean, they can't inflate the money supply, they can't tax the citizens, but the government, by its very own nature, can do that. They are able to supersede the boundaries that the private sector is held back by. So if people are truly held by this negative human nature, I don't think it's wise to give these same humans the right to overstep these boundaries. Because by giving them that level of power, you're just opening the door for problems inherently. So the result here is that this corrupts the marketplace, and now these entities are forced to use the government as their own instrument. I mean, case in point, for example, I did stumble recently across an article called, aptly enough, Higher Ed Needs Lobbyists Too. It was written by Matthew Camp, who I looked at right away and noticed that he was a PhD, not to mention the Director of Government Relations over at Teachers College, as one would expect in this case. Anyway, to summarize it, the article is openly left-leaning. I mean, it outright criticizes Trump and urges lobbyists to act specifically when there's a Democratic president and Congress in power. And anyway, the message of this article can really be condensed down to, well, the government's already giving trillions of dollars to the war in Afghanistan, so therefore it would be better to just invest that money in our education instead. Well, here's an idea. What if we invested in neither? Instead of more lobbying in one area to compete with lobbying in another area, wouldn't it be better to simply cut back on lobbying overall? I mean, two wrongs don't make a right. And one thing I really like is I love the unintentionally telling final sentence of the article, which is, as the old lobbyist saying goes, you're either at the table or on the menu. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. Mr. Camp inadvertently laid out exactly what's wrong with the current statist system that we have throughout this whole article. Anyway, though, I've really been condemning this policy and the people who support it for long enough at this point, so it's really time for me to put my money where my mouth is and offer my own solution. So, in that case, what should we do instead? And how would this avoid the short-sighted fatal flaw that Biden's plan falls into? So look, I fully support reforming college tuition, as well as existing college debt, but it has to be done in a way that doesn't commit this cognitive error. We need to take into account the long-term effects in addition to the short-term effects, and not just how it affects some people, in this case the minority of the general population who took on some obscenely high amount of debt, but all groups of people. There are really two issues at hand here. There's the price of college as it is now, and what to do with the people who are already crippled by college debt. So, right off the bat, I do want to say that universities are a business. Please make no mistake about that. They have a profit incentive, and they're going to do what they can to make a profit in money for themselves. Now, in a free market without government interference, the invisible hand of the marketplace, as Adam Smith put it so eloquently long ago, would bring about a positive social influence. But now, when the government steps in to subsidize this system, this is inevitably going to distort and complicate this market process. So this leads me to my proposal, that is what I think would be a better course of action than what Biden is proposing, his debt transfer plan. Removing these government subsidies of college would do a lot more to lower the price of college. which is already so absurdly overinflated anyway. I mean, these students are, the way I see it, by removing these subsidies, students are inevitably going to be unlikely to pay out of their own pocket for some useless degree. The universities, in this case, from here, they won't be able to fund many of these useless non-STEM departments, and they're eventually going to have to close them down because the artificial demand for these stupid degrees is going to have fallen back to its natural level. As it is right now, these studies degrees are inevitably going to have some kind of negative impact on your tuition, regardless of which college path you chose, even if it is a very indirect one. These subsidies make it appear where there's a demand where there really isn't. If the government is offering something to you at quote-unquote no cost, you're going to be much more likely to consume it. But if you have to pay directly from your own pocket for it, then you're going to be much more hesitant and your demand for it is naturally going to decrease. Without the subsidies, there's less demand. That is, more accurately, we see what the demand truly was all along. And in response, the universities are going to have to adjust to this by lowering their prices accordingly. So when we look at college tuition in this light, it becomes very clear that while college tuition is incredibly high, it's the government that's holding it up there. A natural consequence of implementing this is that students can actually take courses they want without completing courses that are just credits for the sake of credits. I'm referring to the gen eds here. I mean, for me personally, as far as my own college experience, I started out as a plant sciences major back in the day, and I somehow found myself taking a jazz history class at the same time as the relevant core classes. I still don't know what the point of that was, although I do enjoy some Sonny Rollins every now and then as a result. But in all seriousness, though, it really is just a blatant waste of resources and a very inefficient way to set up a curriculum. And I know full well that a lot of the accrediting agencies wouldn't be happy to see these departments close down or to see many fewer students being really pushed into these courses. But since these agencies are precisely the problem here, we can safely conclude that that's going to be for the best. These accrediting agencies have no place in a free market. And furthermore, there are actually currently court cases that have been established that are making it difficult to test these job applicants according to the actual skills that would be required in that industry. I mean, the case of Ritchie versus DeStefano comes to mind. That was back in 2009, I believe. Anyway, overturning these cases would make a good starting point as far as making for a more functional school curriculum, and in effect of that, it would be better training these students for the actual jobs they'll be taking one day. As for another aspect of this, as for the scholars in academia, a lot of their research is being hindered by this current system. Their work is being held up by administrative duties, endless faculty meetings, and just the overall general bureaucracy that results from government intervention. And a better alternative for this would be for these academics to become private entrepreneurs, and they could be working for private research facilities or private sponsors. On a side note, if this were implemented, it would certainly counteract the obvious liberal big government bias that we all know is within academia. I mean, that's precisely where it's coming from in the first place. But anyway, that's what I think should be done about the current costs of college. But this still leaves the question of, what about the people who are already shackled to debt? To put it simply, I think they should be able to default on these loans. If people are filing for bankruptcy, it really is obscene that it's nearly impossible for these people to discharge their student debt. I mean, the very fact these loans are so persistent and won't stop hounding people in debt plays a huge role in why these people are calling for the government forgiveness now. However, what's very important and what they don't realize is that the whole reason it's so hard to discharge this debt in the first place, that actually comes down to a 2005 law, which was passed by Congress, that is, the state. Thanks to that law, less than 3% of the total $1.75 trillion of student debt, as of the time I'm recording this podcast that we have, is eligible to be discharged. So odds are that, as it is, you're doomed, basically, under the current system. What I advocate is that the government decrees be reversed so that there's more leeway to the person in debt, because in this current system, people are now turning to the government to save them from a problem that was put into place originally by the government. Anyway, I should really start wrapping this up from here. So, closing things up here, that's what I suggest. And where my plan differs from the one that the Biden administration is pushing on us, aside from the fact that it would have much better effects, is that none of it requires more state intervention. Quite the contrary, actually. Removing subsidies and reversing unjust laws and statutes that have been passed requires less government, whereas simply transferring the responsibility from that particular individual to the taxpayers as a collective whole obviously requires more. And look, I want to say here that I know that some people out there are just going to throw making an actual rebuttal out of the window, and they're going to resort to personal attacks. They'll just say, Evan, you can't relate. You don't know what it feels like. You don't know what it's like to struggle. Well, putting aside the fact that I worked during college to pay off my tuition, I'm glad you said that. So, over the years, I've made my share of investments. Penny stocks, crypto, you name it. Now, I do want to preface this by saying that I was young at the time and nowhere near as knowledgeable or experienced with money and economics as I am today. I made very bad investments. My penny stocks, they all plummeted, which was bad enough. But then, like all too many people in our society nowadays, I was even robbed in a crypto scam as well. I'm a bit embarrassed to tell you the overall amount that was stolen from the savings that I'd actually earned from my hard work and responsible budgeting, but let me tell you right now that it was much more than $10,000. I was the victim of a flat-out crime. And anyone who's actually familiar with how crypto scams work will tell you that it's a form of theft that, in the vast majority of cases, the funds can't be traced and the victims can't recover their funds. And this was unfortunately no exception. This was one of those times. So I lost a very large amount of money and received nothing in return for it. So you can argue that this isn't the same thing, and in a sense you are right, because my case is clearly worse. I lost money I had earned and got nothing out of it. These college students lose money which they didn't even possess in the first place, and at least they get a college degree out of it, or at least a shot at one. They can actually get something out of it. They're not really being robbed out of it. It's not being pushed or anything like that. Anyway, the overall point I'm trying to make here is that I have since worked hard and earned back all of the money that was stolen from me. It was a very challenging, long process, but I want to say that I never, not for 1 second, thought that the government should step in, they should pay me for my losses, and bail me out with the public's taxpayer money. Now look, you can say that I'm a fool for making that bad investment and falling for a crypto scam, so therefore I shouldn't expect government assistance. But if you do apply that logic, I can then turn around and say that you're a fool for making a bad investment in a college degree that provides no return of investment and falling for the college scam. And look, I'm admittedly pretty embarrassed to share this story, but I'm doing it to provide a rebuttal to this empty, you don't know what it's like ad hominem that gets thrown around far too often, and to let you know that yes, I do know what it feels like to have been cheated and taken advantage of, and to have to struggle as a result. And either way, in any case, that doesn't change the facts of the situation here. Besides, our subjective backgrounds and our feelings have no business determining whether we're allowed to discuss how economics, which is a social science, mind you, works. So anyway, wrapping things up now, I do want to conclude by saying that I'm deeply opposed to Joe Biden's debt forgiveness plan. In reality, rather than forgiving the debt, it punishes all of us. This has been a hotly debated issue for some time, but it really shouldn't be. So many problems in our society, like this one right here, would be solved if we took an approach more in line with the Austrian School of Economics, rather than these Marxist, Keynesian, gimme, gimme, gimme tactics. I really do feel bad about this whole situation, from the people struggling with college debt right now to the people who worked hard to pay theirs off. But that does not excuse this policy by any stretch of the imagination. Anyway, that pretty much summarizes my whole perspective on this matter. So I want to say thanks for tuning in. This has been Evan Morgan of Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow me on social media, subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Have a good one, everybody. Bye-bye.